Good morning. I am Dr. Leeson Taylor, Superintendent of Greenville Public Schools and President of the Mississippi Alliance of Black School Educators. On behalf of this event's organizers and our panelists, I would like to welcome you to this video conversation on the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Obama in December of last year. The purpose of this panel is to facilitate a conversation of educational stakeholders and practitioners around the implications for equity in Mississippi in the coming years. As a reminder to all those in our audience, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which we are calling ESSA, is an update to the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, most recently known as No Child Left Behind Act. This new law represents a shift toward increased state and local autonomy, which presents an opportunity to make equity an even greater priority in working to improve the state and district systems of accountability. I am sure that most of you, as well as most of us, are still shifting through the 1,000-page law to see exactly what it means as the states across the country are putting together teams to do the same thing. Last night, you received a read-ahead document that outlines the provisions of No Child Left Behind, waivers, and the ESSA. This resource also outlines key decision points as well as opportunities for stakeholders to engage with the state and one another to advance through ESSA implementation in our state. These materials in this webinar will be available at partnersforeachandeverychild.org. MDE has created an ESSA planning team to study a path toward implementation. I encourage you all to follow through the MDE website for the posting of opportunities to hear from the state. On Tuesday, March the 1st, 2016 at 9 a.m., there will be a meeting of the Mississippi Board of Education to discuss the Mississippi Department of Education's 5-year strategic plan. This meeting will be held at Mississippi Public Broadcasting, 3825 Ridgewood Road, Jackson, Mississippi. The U.S. Department of Education will be hosting listening sessions in regions around the country. Please look to www.ed.gov/ESSA for listings and information. With this in mind, we have put together a highly distinguished panel chosen to represent diverse perspectives that reflect our state, not because they agree with each other, but for their equal representation. This hour together is meant to be a discussion, not a debate, a vehicle for delivering information and uncovering important questions rather than a platform for advocacy. With us today is Dr. Kent Mcguire, President and CEO, Southern Education Foundation, who will provide a frame for our discussion around equity. And joining our group discussion is Joyce Hillman, educator from DeSoto County and MAE President, Joyce Parker, Executive Director, Mississippi Delta Catalyst Roundtable, Mrs. Etta Taplin, former President of the Mississippi School Board Association, current board member in Pike County, Sanford Johnson, Deputy Director of Mississippi First. Before I turn it over to Dr. Mcguire, let me begin with a few key points regarding our two areas of focus in today's conversation: accountability and stakeholder engagement. First, it's important to note that the law goes into effect in the 2017-18 school year. That means there is still time to figure all of this out and address the important questions raised here today. On accountability, while states have the opportunity to pick their own goals, they must address proficiency gaps, EL proficiency, and graduation rates. Each state must also incorporate one additional measure of school quality or student success in its accountability system. Examples are student engagement, teacher engagement, access and completion of advanced coursework, post-secondary readiness, school climate, etc. Each state will also have to identify and intervene in the bottom 5% of the lowest performing schools as measured by the performance goals that the state sets for itself, and those schools that fail to graduate 68% or more of their students. These schools will have to be identified once every 3 years, beginning in 2017-18. In the area of stakeholder engagement, we also want to emphasize another essential component of the law, and that's stakeholder engagement. The legislation is deliberate in its call for the engagement of stakeholders in key areas of planning, development, and implementation. The reduction of the federal role in holding states and districts accountable for ensuring equity makes it all the more important to have an infrastructure for ongoing stakeholder engagement. That means a framework for meaningful, ongoing stakeholder engagement will be critical to informing implementation of the law and making sure that we're attentive to the learning needs of at-risk, underserved, and vulnerable populations. The first step in building a foundation for stakeholder engagement process is to ensure that we have all operating from a common base of knowledge. Today, our goal is to provide everyone with both an understanding of the law's basic content as well as one another's perspectives. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Kent Mcguire. Dr. Mcguire.
Dr. Taylor, thank you so much. I'm pleased to be on this webinar, and I want to first reiterate a point that that you made by saying that there is a lot of room for state and local action, state and local interpretation of the new law. And it's really important in this period of time between now and the fall, you know, to lean in ways that make sense for Mississippi and that are likely to give rise to a much better policy environment for helping all kids learn, especially the least advantaged. I think I like to use or think in terms of a series of principles about accountability, which is probably the really high stakes issue in ESSA. And I want to offer three and then walk quickly through a list of things that it might be important to think through, and a few comments about stakeholder involvement. But in contrast to No Child Left Behind, which focused to a considerable degree on what we think of as test-based accountability, I'd like to offer three ways of thinking about accountability to help frame how this work might unfold in Mississippi. The first is a focus on learning, which is not the same thing exactly as a focus on achievement as measured on a standardized test. Yes, performance on tests or assessments it matters, it's important, but learning is something bigger than that, and it would give us a broader way of thinking about what we're trying to accomplish. Two is a focus on professionally skilled and committed educators, which is not quite the same thing as a focus on trying to figure out which teachers are effective and which ones aren't. And three is a principle I like to refer to as adequate and appropriate resources. Unrealistic to expect to hold everyone accountable when the playing field is lumpy, it's not level. And so I think these three principles are really useful as a way of getting into a conversation in Mississippi and anywhere else about how to think about accountability. Now, the language in ESSA tracks a growing interest in measuring things other than just tests. And so the good news here is that there's an opportunity to think more broadly about learning and school success through a broader set of criteria, to include things like school climate and family engagement. We know if the climate in school is not wholesome and families aren't engaged, kids don't learn. Elementary and middle schools will be required to use an additional academic indicator than instead of graduation rates, because they're not high schools. The law leaves lots of room for states to make key decisions as to the metrics for school success that they might choose. And so I think having a conversation about what are the things that we really want to see happen in schools and what would be good indicators of those things is an important thing to focus on. And we'll need to work together in developing a strategic approach that includes criteria that not only gives us insights into academic success, but into the supports that students need to be successful. Finally, there will be an even greater premium in ESSA on evidence. So that's a good thing. Because we know so much more about how people learn, we should lean onto that evidence as we think about strategies, for promoting greater equity in the schools. In terms of stakeholder engagement, I think a lot will depend on what stakeholders in Mississippi do to let policymakers know that they're paying attention, that we're actually interested in the decisions they make, and that if need be, we bring pressure to bear on the policy community. The name of the game is all about implementation. The law is passed, and whether it works on behalf of all kids or not is very much a function of how well it is implemented. This is a process, not an event, and in the time between now and, say, November, it's going to really be important for there to be as much dialogue between state, district, school, and stakeholder groups across in Mississippi as we can have. And the stakeholders will need to be informed. I hope the Southern Education Foundation, which is interested in how this process works across the South, I hope we're able to be really very helpful in the steps that you take in Mississippi in that regard. Let me make just a few comments about potential next steps, Dr. Taylor, and then I'll turn it back to you. The department still has a long way to go through its regulatory process with respect to the new law. It's only been a couple of weeks since they received volumes of input from people all over the country, interest groups and the like, and so we want to pay attention to what they do with that guidance as they begin to set the regs. As we begin to collaborate on informing Mississippi state plan, just also think about the state's own regulatory and legislative responsibilities. That's the policy context that will, in the end, matter to how well this law works for children in the state. As one example, Mississippi will need to figure out how to incorporate English language learning proficiency in a more significant and relative way in its state accountability plan moving forward. Mississippi will also need to figure out how to determine what's the right N size, what's the right population for its reporting system, and as timelines in ESSA proceed and get clearer, we'll want to lead by building out a calendar and a strategic vision for your engagement in the process. Dr. Taylor, I was told to stay inside 10 minutes. That's a very difficult thing for me to do ordinarily. But I'm going to pause here and just remind folks on the webinar that SEF thinks of itself as a hub. We're available to answer questions, for instance, about what the law actually says. We're available to help folks in Mississippi be in touch with how this stakeholder engagement process is working in other states across the country, and particularly in the South. Whatever ways we can be helpful, for instance, with workshops later in the year that would really push the process along in a positive and constructive way, that would be how we want to be involved.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mcguire. We really appreciate those words of wisdom. We will now be transitioning to our panel discussion. I would like for each panelist to introduce themselves, mention their name, and we want to make sure that we express to the people who are participating in terms of being on the scheduled webinar today, that we received your advanced questions, and thank you for those, and we will be addressing them. But our first entering topic of discussion would be what each of you are hearing from your various communities that you work in. Let's start with Joyce Hillman of MAE. Joyce, over the past several weeks, you and your staff have been holding regional meetings to hear from your membership about their questions, concerns, thoughts around ESSA. What are you hearing from Mississippi teachers?
Yes, Dr. Taylor, we have been conducting our region meetings for the past 2 weeks across the state. The purpose of our meetings, of course, has to do with our MAE business, but in conjunction with that, we have given a presentation about ESSA to educators in the 7 regions that we have. There are three things that they question, and 3 things that we've discussed basically is training. We realize the importance of all of our educators being trained in the ESSA law. The information should be clear and direct and understandable for our educators so that we know exactly where we stand and what we're supposed to be doing and preparing for all the new measures. The second thing that they're very concerned about is inclusion. Quite often in the education field, as all of you can realize, is that educators sometimes are the last ones to know. Plans are prepared from top down. The last ones to receive the information will be the educator in the classroom, and then quite often the educator is told, do it now. So time is the third element that our educators are very concerned about. We know we're the boots on the ground, and so our educators want to be included in the process and be at the table with all of our stakeholders. We believe that we're the ones who work with the community best. We work with our school board, our administrators, our superintendents, and so these 3 concerns are on the top of our list: training, inclusion, and time.
Okay, Sanford, can you introduce yourself and then proceed with your response?
Yes, my name is Sanford Johnson, Deputy Director of Mississippi First, and we work in policy, research, and advocacy. 3 of our big areas of work over the past couple of years have been around early childhood education, charter school policy, as well as standards testing and accountability. And in each one of those areas, they've been addressed in the new ESSA law. And we also are in those 3 areas, we're working on implementation. So we can speak from a lot of experience that implementation is very difficult, and it's very, very important to get it right, especially in a state like Mississippi, where so many of our students need access to excellent schools and where we have limited resources. So looking at those 3 areas, what we've been hearing a lot, and I would agree with what Joyce said earlier, the need for training is very, very important, especially in areas where access to quality training and professional development is very limited. So we need to focus there. We also need to focus on MDE capacity, making sure that they have the ability to reach every district, every community where training and professional development is needed. And a big frustration that we've heard from educators is around the politicization of standards testing and accountability, and how some of the decisions that are made in Jackson have a big impact on teacher buy-in and overall implementation efforts. So that's what I want to focus on today.
Thank you, Sanford. Mrs. Chaplin?
Well, good morning, everyone. We just finished up our annual conference, and as being a former board president for Mississippi School Boards Association and serving on my local school board, I've heard a lot from board members, because we are policymakers, is how do we set good policies that will be sound policies to make sure that we can implement what the federal laws are passing down to us, and make sure that this is going through the cycle of the state. We talked about who are the stakeholders. We want to make sure that we identify everyone that touches a child. It's not just the teachers, it's not just the administrators, it's not board. We can't just say parents because we also have grandparents involved. We have siblings, uncles, aunts, and just community leaders. We also have to look at the community leaders. We have to look at our business folks. So when we go to the table, everyone needs to be at the table. And there may be more than one table that we have to be at, but we need to have the right people at that table and come together as one to bring each different piece. We also discussed that we have a great concern about the implementation of how we have to have buy-in. People have to understand what it is that they're being expected to do. And once we do that, we need to make sure we don't have the expectation and not give them the tools to complete the task. So that has been one of the biggest things that we've talked about. We also talked about funding. As we all know, that we are in a time where education is changing in the state of Mississippi, and our funding has always been a problem. So that is one of the concerns, is that are we going to be just like it was with No Child Left Behind, where all the mandates came to the state and to our districts, and there was no funding to provide for this. So we want to make sure that that will be taken care of. How will this happen? We don't want to waste funds, but we also want to make sure we can do the things that need to be done in our districts, and all districts are not alike. So therefore, you have to look at each district individually as well as collectively. So there needs to be a lot of collaboration. I know I said a lot of things, but these are the things that will make a plan work. And especially the implementation part. So we have to have the buy-in there, and that's looking at it as policymakers, because that's what school board members do.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Mrs. Parker?
Good morning. Mississippi Delta Catalyst Roundtable is a network of about 10 communities. We have Southern Echo as the anchor group, who provides technical assistance and trainings for these organizations. But these organizations are made up of parents and students, educators, elected officials, people in the community who you would call the actual stakeholders. When you ask the question of what we're hearing around the regions that we're working in, much of it is really the same that everyone else is saying. And that's a good thing, because one of the things we're saying is that we are on the same team. We do have the same concerns, and we're looking at the same students, the same families, because if our communities are going to survive, it's going to be through a very productive educational system. So when you look at ESSA, I agree with Dr. Kent when he says we need to focus on learning versus achievement. Our students really are being tested a lot, but at the end of the day, because Mississippi is at the bottom of the totem pole, where is the achievement? Where is the success coming in? Where is the learning coming in? We want to make sure that there's a seamless transition, meaning that in some of our communities now, it's been 4 or 5 years that we have new administration, new leadership in our communities, and we're saying now, does this mean we start all over again? And sometimes I really support Joyce from MAE in feeling what teachers feel, because we're really seeing a high level of frustration in teachers because they're thinking that they got to do something different. But Dr. Kent, you're right. Teaching and learning takes place when teachers are there prepared to teach and children are there to learn. So when we talk about school climate, the environment of that building, all of that plays into how parents, students, communities are engaged in the decision making. So that's our next concern. What role will we actually play? I was a part of a hearing in DC to really talk to the Department of Ed when it rolled out to say, what is the regulations going to look like? And they're saying, the governor's saying we want a hands off. And we're clear in some of our states, we need you to still have regulatory authority and giving us guidance. Because when we talk about curriculums, we know you can't tell us what curriculum, but we do want you to look for plans that say we want continuity. We don't want you to buy a new curriculum today because it's something great, or even when teachers are saying once they get everything down pat and they're really teaching, then somebody tell them we got to do something different. And the last thing I want to say is the question of resources. and that's real important. We know many of our districts look at budget and say that that's money that has to be spent for items based on what the category is or the line item. One of the things our district is looking at, and I really have to applaud our school board and superintendent, is that budget is policy. So when you start talking about we got to keep children in school, we came up with a supportive school, supportive services department in our school. Now these are the same staff people that were probably there, but now they meet together. Because if we're telling teachers, and once again, shout out to teachers, if we're telling them that they've got to keep children in school, then we've got to figure out how do we support families and children with the baggage everybody brings into this process. So just want to say good morning, excited about this conversation.
Thank you, Ms. Parker. We appreciate it. And that provides us an excellent transition into the first question that'll go to Ms. Joyce Hillman. How can teachers as stakeholders hold states and districts accountable to including them in decisions around ESSA?
Well, first of all, let me thank Ms. Parker. Thank you so much for your support of teachers, and I know the rest of the panel supports the teachers in our state. MAE is an organization that does work with teachers all across the state. We have members in every district, and our work is very important to this process. We believe that that teachers will have to hold or can hold our districts and our state accountable, but they must be trained first, and they must put themselves in a situation to be trained. They must learn as much as they can, and then they must be organized. They must come together, as we have seen them do just recently on our funding issue. We believe that the teachers, and when they come together and when they make a plan, and when they approach the superintendent, the school board, and their community, that those people will listen to them and that they will become a part of it. But they must speak up, and they must become trained, and they must be a part of the process themselves. They want to show that they want to be included, and they must include in their scope the entire community that supports the education of the children in the schools that they represent. And we believe that that's what our educators are doing, and so we are continuously working on training. We have some more training coming up, and we are encouraging our teachers to be knowledgeable and then to come together as one in their district to speak out and to be a part of the whole process.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Mrs. Taplin, as a board member over an extended period of time, you've seen the past implementation efforts that dealt with No Child Left Behind, even to right now as we're dealing with waivers and as we've transitioned to Common Core. What mistakes have you seen that we could be collectively made aware of, and how can we learn from these mistakes to ensure equitable implementation of ESSA?
Well, in the past, we've had several things that come down from the pipe, and I don't think we had the actual buy-in that was needed to pass these things along to our districts. Implementation is very important in how we do it, and I think what has happened in the past is that there has been a lack of communication between all parties involved. We get mandates from the federal government. They come to our states, to MDE, and we're not always clear on what is expected. That has always been a problem, has been the implementation and the expectation. And if we're going to pass it on and have high expectations, then we have to be clear, and we have to communicate, and we have to collaborate on all the efforts. Again, I cannot say this anymore, that we have to have the right people at the table, and I don't think that's what has happened in the past. Those people who need to be there, the boots on the ground people, our teachers, our superintendents, our administrators, our parents, ballot community leaders, people from low-income neighborhoods. All these people need to be at the table because they can express the interest of what is happening in their homes or in their communities, and this hasn't been happening. So if we can just change the way we look at how we implement things and take on a more open-minded approach about who we're going to invite in, because we can't keep having the same old people sitting around making the decision, because how's that work for us? It hasn't in the past. So I think that we have to be more open as to who we're going to bring to the table and how they're going to sit there. So implementation for ESSA to work will need to be with everyone, not just one person, not just one group of people. And as a policymaker, as a school board member, we make the policies. So sometimes we're the buffer between our schools and between our communities, whether it's our families or whether it's our business leaders, we're that buffer. So we have to be able to decide and decipher what's best for our schools. And in working with all of these people, we have to come to some common ground to how we're going to pass these things. So that also depends on what our legislation's passing down the pipe to us. Once it's passed, we've got to take it and we've got to deal with it. We've got to make it work, because every day we still have to make sure our children are learning. That's not going to change. So we can't lose our focus. So that's how I feel that the implementation has been such a poor piece of how we use buy-in for our teachers and everyone involved.
Dr. Mcguire, from working with an organization that spans several states, when we look at the implementation of No Child Left Behind, moving forward to the implementation of ESSA, what pitfalls can you suggest that we avoid, or what are you seeing other states doing?
Well, looking back in time, we saw many states put lots of energy into metrics and measures of success. We saw a lot less energy put into building state and local capacity, to deliver good education. So, sort of another way to say this would simply to be, while we saw an enormous emphasis placed on accountability, states did not, generally speaking, do as much to build state and local capacity to improve teaching and learning. You really want both, not one, or the other. And so I think that's Dr. Taylor, a core lesson from the last period of reauthorization into the next. Now we're in a situation in which there's even more state responsibility for working out the details. And I think with that responsibility comes an obligation to attend to questions of what will it take for our schools to deliver for all kids. And I simply would return to the three principles I mentioned at the outset. That has to do with really bearing down on learning. It has to do with understanding what the adults need, teachers and administrators, to do their best work. And it has to do with making sure schools have the resources they need to do what we expect them to do.
Thank you, Dr. Mcguire. One of your key points talked about metrics and assessments. So that leads into Sanford, your question. While annual assessments have shifted several times over the last 3 years in Mississippi, how will this impact the state's ability to identify and support the lowest performing 5% of schools in Mississippi?
This has been a big area of frustration that I've heard from a lot of educators, a lot of principals, a lot of superintendents, a lot of teachers. And we're in a pilot year again. There were a lot of teachers who talked about how challenging the transition was to go from our old testing system to PARC, and now, because of politics, I think politics had a lot to do with it. We were now saying, okay, we're gonna scrap that and we're gonna do something else. And there were in a lot of districts, especially in some of our most challenging districts, there were a lot of teachers who weren't fully bought in, and there were a lot of folks who thought these new tests, these new standards, it's just a fad, it's just something folks are doing, we'll get rid of it at some point. And as soon as we came in and said, well, we're going to scrap these tests and do something else, there were always those folks who would say, see there, I told you, yeah, it's all going away. So it's made it difficult for, I know an organization, we've been working with educators saying, no, this is a paradigm shift. This is not just a new fad. This is a new way of teaching. This is a new way of learning. This is a new way of that we're going to, organize schools and train teachers. And it's been difficult to make that argument. So buy-in has been really challenging because of the constant changes. What I will say about the assessments, and this goes back to an earlier point about implementation, it seems like there's always a lot of focus on policy adoption. And once the policy is adopted, we pat ourselves on the back and we celebrate, and then, okay, that was fun, let's move on to the next thing. And that's something that we focus on a lot. Like, if you get a pre-K bill passed, you have to stick with it to make sure that it's implemented effectively. So now that we have the Mississippi Assessment Program in place, we're hoping that this is something that we can actually stick with, and that we can get the buy-in from educators, from our boards, from our school leaders, and that we can actually start, once these tests start to count, we can start providing schools with the resources that they need and to hold schools accountable for student success.
Gotcha. Thank you, Sanford.
Dr. Taylor, before
Yes,
you move on, can I ask us, but don't you think that we need to also make sure that the people know what they're buying into? A lot of times they don't know what they're buying into because the program has not been adequately explained to say, well, this is what we're trying to do. They don't know what the end results is. We haven't begun with the end in mind, and we don't know what we're trying to get them to buy into. And I think that's what happened with No Child Left Behind, is that there wasn't enough talk about what it is that we expect our children to do and to learn, and enough talk around the table with those that needed to be there to say, well, this is what we're expecting you to do, this is the end result that we want to see, and this is how we want you to do it. I don't think that was there. And I wanted to piggyback on what Stanford said.
I would completely agree with that, and there a lot more could have been done in terms of sharing with parents and sharing with the community. This is what you're going to see in your classroom with these new standards, with the new test. And because that information wasn't shared by educators, it's like, this is what I saw on Facebook. This is what I heard on talk radio. This is what I saw here and there. We had a lot of success. We had an opportunity to actually train teachers on the coast we called them our core advocates. And that was the best line of defense in terms of getting to go back to their school and say, this is what math is going to look like. Here's what a problem is going to look like. Here's how you can help your children. This is what my English class is going to look like. It's very similar to what we even did, and this is an unrelated area, but what we did around sex education is to have teachers come in. This is what we're actually going to provide in the classroom. And once parents actually hear that from trusted teachers that are in their community, in their schools, it really helps with buy-in.
Gotcha. Joyce Parker, as we look at ESSA, it calls for stakeholder engagement in certain decisions to be made by the state and the local education agencies. What is the value of local networks like the Mississippi Delta Catalyst Roundtable? How can they serve as a model for the larger state regional stakeholder engagement?
Well, Dr. Taylor, I think for us, we're looking at, like I said, 10 communities: Tunica, Montgomery County, Washington County and Greenville, Holmes County, Webster County, Pontotoc, Grenada, Tallahatchie County, Sunflower County, and then we're looking at Hinds County, where Southern Echo is actually located. I know the introduction seems to say that I was the executive director, but I'm not. I'm the network weaver. And what that means is that each of these are individual communities who come together, It wasn't anything that we went to school to become or to formalize organizations. It was parents and students and people in the community coming together and saying, hey, look, we got to do something. And as a part of that process, we began to network and to connect with each other around the commonalities that we see around education. So when you have a network like the Mississippi Delta Catalyst Roundtable, you're ready to respond versus react. We reacted to No Child Left Behind, but in doing that reaction, we were still in a place, thanks to Southern Echo and then the experience of all of these organizations who started out back in the mid-1990s in their communities around education issues. They had already begun to build relationships with the Department of Education. They had already begun to see in their communities how they need to become school board members, how they needed to be able to bring parents to the table in terms of those smaller communications and communities and smaller conversations. But when No Child Left Behind came out, one of the things that we did was we started having Achievement Gap conferences where we began to bring folks together. Someone was saying, and I think that was Ms. Taplin saying that, how do we make sure that we get buy-in? And the only way you can get buy-in is that you have an informed community, or those people being impacted understand what it is. When ESSA rolled out, many of these organizations, same organizations, have become a part of a national campaign. Many of you may have heard, Dignity in Schools campaign. That was work that started in Holmes County of Mississippi when folks started seeing children on the street saying that, hey, look, something wrong with this. They're getting out of school, pushed out, suspended, or whatever, ending up in the jail. We started the schoolhouse to jailhouse. Now you hear what? The school to prison pipeline. The Dignity in Schools campaign, and many of us, like I said, are a part of that. Our voices are really heard inside of those pieces of engagement, school climate, anything that you see inside of this ESSA is the voices of many of us who took the time to leave our community and go and join with 25 other states with over 100 other organizations or communities who say the same thing. Education is important. So how do we as stakeholders begin to have a voice? There are going to be a lot of opportunities for us to engage. At the state level, some of us have already called the State Department of Education here to say, hey, look, where are you on the state plan? I had a conversation with Mr. Thigpen, but that means that they're saying that we're doing it by departments right now. We just need them to know that we need to be a part of that conversation. As a partner, our state code says that 37-1-2, we teach our parents, says that everybody in the entire state and in every community has the responsibility to improve the quality of education, shared responsibilities. Networks like the Mississippi Delta Catalyst Roundtable is replicable. And we are willing and really available and really want to, well, we're going to need to have the support of other communities. It was just parents starting together saying that we got to make a difference, and it has been formalized. We provide training, technical support, we provide advocacy, we provide, finally, we have a report that we've done explaining the disparities in student performances. We've got maps. So I think the network that Mississippi Delta Catalyst Roundtable didn't start yesterday, and there's a lot of experience behind it, but we believe that if parents are given information, students who are on the front line, they're part of this process. Our work is intergenerational, meaning that in these meetings, we have students that say, hey, look, the plan says that the teacher was supposed to do this, but guess what's really happening in the classroom? Or they're saying, you know, my teacher's really trying, but she doesn't have what she needs. So we are the people and the places that when this implementation, and as it's implemented, we are going to have to be at the table, and we have a critical role that we have to play.
Thank you, Ms. Parker. Ms. Hillman, the law calls for a heightened focus on our EL student populations. For example, EL proficiency must now be included in each state's accountability system. What can you share with us about how teachers in Mississippi are focusing on this issue, and that can provide a model for how we might use stakeholder engagement to solve issues related to our most in-need populations?
Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for giving me the opportunity to brag on some of our teachers and what they have begun to do already. ESSA does open the doors to educators to get involved in the work of district and the state. A perfect example of that is the teacher leadership that is already making a difference in the largest school district in the state with a group of ELL educators who have joined together to advocate for their ELL students. They have already begun to realign their curriculum with the new federal mandates dealing with English language learners, and are already looking into studying the use of the EL proficiency as an indicator for the district and state's accountability system, including measuring and reporting EL proficiency at the elementary, the middle, and high school levels. We know that the state will have to incorporate EL proficiency in a more significant and relevant way in its state accountability system moving forward. We know that this group of educators they've already gotten together. They have made plans. They have given themselves a name of the North Mississippi ELL Advocacy Group, and they are working in that district, but they have moved. They are including surrounding county districts. The Mississippi Association of Educators is working with them, as well as with NEA, to expand that to a region. And that would include North Mississippi, both east and west. And then they want to bring that, because we are working with MDE, bring that into the entire state, so that this group of educators has already begun working with parents, with their communities, and with the all education leaders to provide what is necessary for the ELL students to succeed. And this is one of those groups that we have to concentrate on, and one of the groups that has been named as a group that has to be targeted by the state. So we feel very excited that this group of teachers have become teacher leaders, and they have already begun the work. Even before the ESSA law was signed, they had begun the work, and now that the law is there, they know that they have even more of a responsibility and more power to move forward with all the groups and the stakeholders. And in doing so, Dr. Taylor, we have learned that, and these educators have said, wow, the community is behind us, the community supports us. The other thing that they have recognized is that that MDE, we've spoken of capacity of MDE for some of these issues, that these educators are working together and actually helping MDE to move forward in this process. They are doing the legwork. They are doing the work and providing information to MDE. And so there's a real collaboration there, and a collaboration from that district to the districts in the surrounding areas. And then Mississippi Association of Educators and NEA is moving forward to put that across the state. Having to do with resources, and often the ELL students, the resources are limited to these students and to the parents. Some districts do not have educators in place that are leaders in that area. So the ELL teachers recognize that oftentimes the success of the student depends on what the parent knows about what is going on in the schools. Just like Ms. Parker said and Ms. Taplin said, that the parents need to know what the students are expected to do, what the students need to know. And oftentimes, because of the language barrier, our parents don't understand what the students are having to do. They come from a different culture, they come from a different education system, and so this advocacy group is moving forward in this manner, and we're very excited about the teacher leadership that is coming out of this program. And we just want to let everyone know that that's an exemplary work. If we can take that and put it into other groups, then we can move forward with the ESSA and with making sure that each student, every student in our schools, have success.
Gotcha. Mr. Johnson, while early childhood education itself is not a focal point of today's discussion, how might stakeholders consider it in terms of ESSA accountability?
Well, I think pre-K should be a part of the discussion because it's so important. If you look at our lowest performing school districts, our focus and priority schools, there's a really good chance you're going to see schools and you're going to see communities where access to high quality early childhood education is very limited. So that's something that we've been working on a good bit. One thing that's also included in the law is encouraging collaboration at the community level, and that's exactly how our pre-K law has been structured, the Early Learning Collaborative Act. That was passed in 2013. I believe we have 11 different collaboratives across the state that are where it's a partnership between public school districts, Head Start, and private child care centers to increase access to high quality pre-K for our 4-year-olds. So we're hoping that that's something that'll expand in the years to come. We are also doing a study of how Title I funds are used by school districts to increase access to pre-K. This has been something that's been going on in school districts for a while, but that information has not been shared with the public. So you can have a great program in Meridian and other parts of the state, but folks in the Delta, folks in DeSoto County don't know about it. So we're not replicating good ideas and the innovative things that are happening with Title I funds in districts. So we're trying to do a study of that to try to figure out how this money is being used in districts so we can make recommendations on things that all school districts can be doing. And there may be a theme here, but we also need greater capacity with MDE to be able to support collaborators and support districts that want to do more around early childhood education.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Dr. Mcguire, from your work, what are the top 3 questions parents, educators, and community leaders should be asking regarding how ESSA will impact students, particularly vulnerable populations, such as African American or Hispanic youth?
Well, I think that if you think about NCLB, it was a top-down policy. ESSA opens up the possibility for more of a bottom-up, process to unfold. But this is why I think attention to stakeholder engagement matters so much in the short run. And so I think the things I heard Ms. Parker say, Ms. Taplin say in particular, are really important about opportunities for parents to, to weigh in. The questions they might ask, Dr. Taylor, I think, really hinge on their vision for children and what they value about kids. So if it were me, I would want to see a focus on the assets and abilities that students have, not just their disabilities or deficits. I would want to see a focus on inclusion, not exclusion. So paying attention to attendance rates and chronic absenteeism and the prevalence of mental and physical health concerns that inhibit participation in school. I want to see a focus on arts and music and civics, as well as reading and math. A discourse about growth and continuous and improvement, not just cut scores. Finally, if I'm a parent or an advocacy group, I would have questions about our infrastructure, our capacity to actually implement the new law well. How organized is the Department of Education to support schools with needs? What are the plans for spotting implementation challenges and addressing them as they occur? And what will our state officials do to make public information about how well things are going? Very difficult for parents and advocates to participate if they don't have the information and haven't been given an opportunity to kind of weigh in on the facts. So that's a longer answer than what are the three things I'd want to know if I were a parent. But I tried to answer the question in a way that fits with the moment in terms of kind of what's at stake.
Thank you, Dr. Mcguire. Mrs. Parker, the state needs to choose an additional indicator in its new accountability system. Some suggestions for this indicator include school discipline, climate issues. We've heard Dr. Mcguire talk about attendance and chronic absenteeism. Some suggestions include some suggestions include climate issues. How can local organizations like the Delta Catalyst Roundtable and its work on these issues be more useful in providing context to the state to help inform its decision?
And it's very appropriate that I followed Dr. Mcguire, because all of the things that he just mentioned in that list of things really feed into how we have been working. We have been meeting with the Department of Education in terms of expectation, especially around the third grade literacy piece. We've used that as an opportunity to figure out how does the state build capacity, but also how do you use support of parents and students in communities and other stakeholders to make sure that this law does not become a detriment to our children through retention. So when you ask what that next indicator should be, school climate. School climate really speaks to all of these things. School climate is dictated by the vision and values of folks. School climate also talks about what are the assets of children. We work with parents of students with disabilities. Here in Greenville, where I am working, specifically across this roundtable, many of us do work with special needs children. What we're looking at is transition. What does that look like? Because a child may be in a wheelchair, what else can they do? Because they may have a cognitive disability, is there any other ways they can do things? Are there other ways to assess it? School climate looks at the healthy environment of not only the school, but it makes us look at our communities as well. When you talk about school climate, you talk about trauma-informed care. You talk about children coming from environments within our community where violence is, in situations in our communities where stuff is going on, just stuff is happening. But if we look at school climate, you're also looking at absenteeism. Why are children not coming? Sometimes chronic absenteeism has to do with the environment in the school, where children just don't want to be there. But sometimes it's about children at home, raising everybody else, including themselves, being the parent in that setting. So we talk about looking at school climate. Arts and music is major. Thank you, Dr. Mcguire. When I was in D.C. and we were talking to the Department of Education about what things, just like we're having this conversation, there were people from arts and music saying that the value of that in our schools. Here in Mississippi, not just the Delta, but across the state, how are we looking at that? Because when children can see themselves successful in anything, we know that they will find that they can be successful in all things. The other piece of it is infrastructure. Our organization now is working with each other in terms of, we look at school plans. We learn from each other. What are those best practices? When I talk to someone from Tunica or Montgomery County, Holmes County, what are y'all doing? Then we come back and try to replicate it. But then I'm able to share what we're doing in Greenville and say these things really do work. So when we talk about how we're going to move forward, children are not just acting out. Let's be real, there is something going on. And it could be from the academics, it could be from the lack of classroom management, it could be from the fact that our school is labeled a failing school, so the expectation is that we don't do anything. We've got to look at, I think if we put up one of these from the state as an indicator, I think school climate would really cover a lot of the areas that we know need to be taken care of in terms of how organized MDE is in implementation, in terms of what will states need in terms of appointing people to even carry it out, even about building capacity. We're saying that we're here. We've been at the table. We want to continue to be at the table. But we know if we are not, and when I say we, parents, students, and stakeholders are not at the table, the implementation is not going to happen. And we're going to have some issues that could have been addressed. And so school climate for me would definitely be that indicator, listing all these other pieces under that.
Mrs. Taplin, as a board member, what additional indicator do you feel would be beneficial for implementation of ESSA?
Well, I think I want to sum this up in 3 words: educate, communicate, and collaborate. So those are the 3 things that I think are very important, is that we educate everybody involved. We communicate those things, because if we don't communicate, then the interpretation is left to assumptions, and then that we collaborate and we bring all these people together. And that's where I want to leave my piece at, because as a board member, I think those are very important pieces, is that we have to educate everybody, we have to communicate with everyone, and then we have to learn to share and collaborate so we can come up with the same things.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Hillman?
I would piggyback on that and say those are the 3 things that we need to emphasize and work toward. Is we need to collaborate, we need to inform, we need to educate. I think that we as educators, we're used to, and I've been in education over 37 years, and when we talked about community involvement, we talked about fundraising, come to a ball game, come to a PTA meeting, and raise funds. And so this new thing of collaboration with our community and having groups like what Ms. Parker has shared with us, actually having parents and community leaders come to the schools and see what we really do in those classrooms and give suggestions for improvement, and how that some of our schools have made improvements because the community has become involved in what we're doing. That has made a huge difference. With some of our schools have made a turnaround. Some schools, F schools, moved up to B school because the community has come and supported and not just criticized. They've come in and they've been positive. They've done paint up and fix up, even something like that has improved the condition of the school, the climate, the physical part of the school, where students are excited to come to school to see those pretty buildings and participate in the activities. We have one school up in the Delta, and they call on their dads to come and control the traffic at the end of the day and the beginning of the day, and to participate and come and learn how to tutor their students. And that's a new program that a principal has put into place. So collaboration, and then having our parents be educated to what we're trying to do is so extremely important to our educators. And I know that in the communities where our educators feel comfortable with those parents and the community leaders becoming involved, our schools are improving, and our community is helping provide resources and letting our lawmakers know that some of our, we really do need those funds to provide the resources for our students. So I appreciate all these comments and everything about our communities becoming engaged with our educators that really want to make a difference in what we're doing.
Mr. Johnson?
Sorry, I had myself on mute there. I definitely agree about collaboration, and that can serve several different areas, like community level collaboration, where everybody on the community, whether you have kids in school or not, working together to make sure that public schools are great. I also think there should be more collaboration among stakeholder groups, education policy groups, and any groups that are concerned about education for kids. That is something that we have not done well in the state of Mississippi. If you take 10 issues and you agree on 9 of them, like you may disagree on one issue, oh, I don't want to work with you anymore, bye. And we can't afford to do that in the state of Mississippi. There just are not enough of us, and there are not enough resources to go around. So we've got to do a better job of working together. In terms of a different indicator, I would also like to see us look more at what happens to our students after they graduate from high school. We are looking to increase the graduation rates of our students in all of our high schools across the state, but what I hear from a lot of college students is that they get to that first semester and they realize in that first class, I did not get the education that I needed. Like I'm weak in this area, I'm weak in that area. So I would like to see what happens to our students after they graduate. How many students need remediation? How many students are able to get their 2-year degree? How many students are able to get their 4-year degree? And I think that's a real important indicator related to the quality of our high schools in the state of Mississippi.
Excellent, excellent. In addition, as we look at accountability and the measurements that's being put in place for accountability, how do you see that taking shape with educator as well as stakeholder engagement? How can we engage the communities that we represent, the groups that we represent around this measurement of accountability? Ms. Parker, can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Yes, I think in terms of looking at the measurements, the first thing is that we all have to be at the table when we set up the matrix. When we decide what we're going to measure and what success looks like, we've got to be there. I think that's going to be very critical. When we start talking about changing the environment in schools and looking at measurements of growth and looking at success, post-secondary success of students, we definitely have to, and I think Dr. Mcguire started us when he talked about what are our values, what is our vision, and we don't get a chance to do that. We need to take that opportunity with ESSA. Once again, we were reactive to No Child Left Behind, but in all honesty, from a perspective of the roundtable and community-based organizations and family and children, we see this glass as being half full. We don't see it being half empty. We see a lot of possibilities. We see a lot of opportunities. And that's why we want to be at the table. Because I agree with you, Sanford. Many times we don't agree across the board on everything. But even in this conversation, we agree with more things than we don't. And if we are given the opportunity to have a real dialogue and to respect and regard what everybody brings to the table, we're going to be so much farther ahead. And we're going to be able to make those real measurements count. We've got to know what children are getting. We got to know where the growth is. There is our workforce now that they are giving tests and figuring out where children are when it comes to the industry. But what they're also going to use those test scores to tell our school districts, hey, look, children are not doing very well in math, or they're not doing very well in reading. Does that mean we want to fail them? No. That just means that we need to beef up our game. Teachers are saying that, every time that there's a pacing guide or there's something else, a test that we've got to help make sure children pass, I don't like the notion of teaching to the test. I'm more creative than that. So then how do we measure what their growth is in that classroom? Is it just academics, or is it that when they're talking to students, they can actually reach that higher level of thinking because of the way that the teachers have approached them? I know our time is almost up, and this is a lot of information, but Dr. Taylor, I just want to say to folks, all of us being at the table together is the only way that this is going to work and having our best results.
Thank you, Ms. Parker. Ms. Taplin.
Yes.
Do you want to add anything to that question?
Just that we need to make sure that we have comparable data. In the past, I don't know, we need to make sure we're comparing apples to apples. So that means that we need to be looking at everything on an equal level, equal playing fields. Oftentimes we don't compare. We put everything in a cookie cutter mode and say this is how it's going to go. We can't do that. So we just need to meet our children where they are and bring them to where we want them to be.
As the moderator, you know, in my other life, I serve as a superintendent. And through conversations that we've had across dealing with other superintendents, one key point that they're looking at in terms of ESSA is that this will provide an opportunity, if all stakeholders are engaged, to replicate success rather than to focus on failure. Superintendents are complaining that the previous accountability models are more about got you rather than help you. And hopefully through dealing with ESSA, we will be able to build up, even in the low 5%, what best practices can be put in place in order to build those schools and serve those vulnerable students. Because at the end of the day, it's about what are we producing and how are they being productive members of society. And I think we can all agree on that point. Well, we've actually reached the time to close. I want to once again thank everyone that has served as a panelist. I want to thank all the stakeholders who signed in and who are participating in terms of this conversation today. We thank you for submitting questions and furthering the discussion within your own networks. The materials today can be referenced at partnersforeachandeverychild.org. This webinar also will be available at that website. Also, again, please look to the Mississippi Department of Education's webpage at www.mde.k12.msus and www.ed.gov/ESSA for information about public meetings. Please attend those sessions. Make sure that your voice is being heard. Also, look out for upcoming opportunities for engagement, as we intend for this to be the beginning of our conversation and work, not the end. This webinar is just the first of many steps that we will be taking toward the proper implementation of this act. I would like to once again close by telling everyone thank you. We appreciate your time, your effort, your energy, and be blessed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.